first thing you notice about Oakhaven isn't what you see. It's what you don't hear. No birds. No wind through the pines. Just a thick, heavy pressure against your eardrums that feels like being underwater. I stood at the edge of the valley, the rusted "Welcome Home" sign creaking on a single hinge, the only sound for miles. I had come back for Elena. Her last letter had been a frantic scramble of ink, talking about the hum and how the neighbors were changing. I stepped onto Main Street. The asphalt was cracked, bone dry. My boots hitting the ground sounded like gunshots in the oppressive quiet. I saw a figure in the window of the old bakery, Mrs. Gable. She was standing perfectly still, her forehead pressed against the glass. I waved, but she didn't move. As I got closer, my stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. Mrs. Gable didn't have a face anymore. Not a human one. Thick, black surgical thread was crisscrossed over her lips in a brutal, jagged pattern. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed on something behind me. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. The hum Elena mentioned started then. A low-frequency vibration that rattled my teeth. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical presence. I ducked into the hardware store, the bell above the door muffled by a piece of duct tape. The air inside smelled of dust and copper. "Elena," I whispered. The word felt heavy, like it was being swallowed by the walls. A floorboard creaked in the back. I grabbed a heavy wrench from a display rack. Out of the shadows emerged a man I barely recognized as Mr. Henderson, the town's former sheriff. He was gaunt, his skin the color of wet ash. He held a finger to his stitched-up lips, his eyes pleading. He pointed to a chalkboard on the counter. In shaky white letters, it read, "Loud as death. The Father listens." He grabbed my arm with a strength born of pure terror and pulled me behind the counter. Outside, the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, distorted shadows across the street. And then, the shadows began to detach themselves from the buildings. They didn't move like light. They flowed like ink. One shadow, tall and spindly, paused in front of the bakery. It reached out a long, multifaceted limb and touched the glass. Mrs. Gable didn't scream. She couldn't, but her eyes rolled back into her head as she collapsed. Henderson gripped my hand, his fingernails digging into my skin. He pointed to the back door. We had to move. We had to find Elena before the sun went down completely, because in Oakhaven, the dark didn't just hide things. Transformed them. The first thing you notice about Oakhaven isn't what you see. It's what you don't hear. No birds. No wind through the pines. Just a thick, heavy pressure against your eardrums that feels like being submerged in deep, black water. I stood at the edge of the valley, my old truck idling with a rattle that felt like a sacrilege in this place. The rusted "Welcome Home" sign creaked on a single hinge, the only organic sound for miles. I had come back for Maya. Her last letter had been a frantic scramble of ink, talking about the hum and how the neighbors were changing. I remembered Oakhaven as a place of summer fairs and loud porch laughs. Now it looked like a corpse left out in the sun. I stepped onto Main Street. The asphalt was cracked and bone dry. My boots hitting the ground sounded like gunshots in the oppressive quiet. I saw a figure in the window of the old bakery, Mrs. Gable. She was standing perfectly still, her forehead pressed against the glass. I waved, a reflex of my old life, but she didn't move. As I got closer, my stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. Mrs. Gable didn't have a human face anymore. Thick, black surgical thread was crisscrossed over her lips in a brutal, jagged pattern, pulling her skin into a permanent, agonized pucker. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed on something directly behind my shoulder. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. The hum Maya mentioned started then. A low-frequency vibration that rattled my teeth and made the marrow in my bones feel like it was boiling. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical weight. I ducked into the hardware store, the bell above the door muffled by a thick piece of duct tape. The air inside smelled of stale dust and copper. "Maya," I whispered. The word felt heavy, like it was being physically swallowed by the walls. A floorboard creaked in the back. I grabbed a heavy pipe wrench from a display rack. Out of the shadows emerged a man I barely recognized as Mr. Sterling, the town's former mayor. He was gaunt, his skin the color of wet ash. He held a finger to his stitched-up lips, his eyes pleading. He pointed to a chalkboard on the counter. In shaky white letters, it read, "Loud as death. The Father listens." Sterling gripped my hand, his fingernails digging into my skin. He pointed to the back door. We had to move. We had to find Maya before the sun went down completely, because in Oakhaven, the dark didn't just hide things, transformed them. Sterling led me through the alleyways, moving with a fluid, silent grace that felt entirely unnatural for a man of his age. Every time my boot clicked against a stone, he flinched as if I'd fired a weapon. The hum was getting louder now, a rhythmic thrumming that seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat. We reached Maya's house on the edge of the woods. The front door was hanging open. Sterling refused to go inside. He backed away into the trees, shaking his head, his stitched mouth twitching in a silent scream. I stepped over the threshold. The house was cold. On the kitchen table, a half-eaten meal sat covered in gray mold. I found Maya in the basement. She wasn't stitched, not yet. She was sitting in the center of the room, surrounded by hundreds of lit candles that didn't flicker. She was humming. It was the same frequency as the town, a drone that made my vision blur. "Maya, we have to go," I said, reaching for her. She turned to me, and for a second, I saw my sister. Then her jaw unhinged, stretching far wider than any human bone should allow. She wasn't humming. Something inside her was. A dark, oily shape moved beneath the skin of her throat. "Julian," she rasped, the voice sounding like grinding stones. "You're late for the harvest." Suddenly, the candles went out. Not blown out, extinguished by a sudden vacuum of air. In the pitch black, I heard the sound of 1,000 needles piercing fabric. The Father wasn't a man. It was the silence itself, and it had finally found a voice. The basement didn't just feel cold. It felt empty, as if the air itself had been stripped of its molecules. Maya, or whatever was wearing Maya's skin, stood perfectly still. The hum was no longer a background noise. It was a physical presence, a vibrating pressure that made my eyes water and my gums bleed. "The harvest isn't about grain, Julian," the thing in Maya's voice croaked. It didn't use her vocal cords. The sound seemed to emanate from the shadows behind her. "It's about the frequency. The world is too loud. All that screaming, all that music, all that life. It's a cacophony that hurts the Father. We are just the dampeners." I stepped back, my heels hitting the bottom step. My mind was screaming to run, but my legs felt like they were set in concrete. Where is my sister? Where is the real Maya? The thing that looked like my sister tilted its head, a sickening crack echoing in the small room. "She is the first note of the new song." Suddenly, the floorboards above groaned. Not the sound of someone walking, but the sound of wood being crushed. The Father was coming. I didn't wait to see what it was. I lunged forward, not away from Maya, but toward the old workbench. I grabbed a flare gun I'd seen earlier, a relic from our father's boat. I didn't aim at the creature. I aimed at the stack of old, dry newspapers and oil rags in the corner. Whump! The burst of light was blinding. For a second, the basement was bathed in a brilliant, violent red. And in that light, I saw it. The Father wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. It was a mass of vibrating, translucent tendrils that filled the entire upper floor, reaching down through the cracks in the wood like the roots of a poisonous tree. It looked like sound made flesh, erratic, pulsing, and hungry. The fire caught instantly. The heat was a shock to the system, breaking the paralysis. But more importantly, the fire was loud. The crackle of burning wood and the roar of the flames acted like a physical blow to the entity. The tendrils recoiled, shrieking in a frequency that shattered every glass jar in the basement. "Julian, stop!" the Maya thing screamed, her voice finally sounding human, filled with a terror I recognized from our childhood. I grabbed her arm. Her skin felt like cold wax, but I didn't let go. I dragged her toward the coal chute, the only way out that wasn't blocked by the pulsating mass of the father. We scrambled through the narrow opening, the smell of smoke and ozone filling my lungs. We tumbled onto the damp grass outside. Behind us, the house was a pillar of fire. The silence of Oakhaven was being ripped apart by the sirens of the fire alarm. A sound that shouldn't have been possible, yet someone must have triggered the old town system in the chaos. We ran. We didn't look back until we reached the truck at the valley's edge. I threw Maya into the passenger seat and slammed the pedal down. The truck roared, its mechanical scream a beautiful, chaotic middle finger to the silence of the valley. As we cleared the ridge, the hum finally faded. My ears popped, and for the first time in hours, I could hear the wind. "We're safe," I panted, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. "Maya, we're out." Maya didn't answer. She was staring straight ahead at the dark road illuminated by our headlights. "Maya!" I reached over to touch her shoulder. She turned to look at me. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the dashboard light. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of old earth and static. "You did well, Julian," she whispered. But she wasn't using her mouth. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and I realized with a jolt of pure, icy horror that they weren't just closed. They were sewn shut, with thick, black surgical thread. The voice hadn't come from her. It had come from me. My own mouth had moved without my permission. My own voice had spoken the Father's words. I looked in the rearview mirror. My reflection stared back, but my lips were moving in a perfect, silent rhythm, stitching themselves together with invisible thread. The silence hadn't stayed in Oakhaven. I had carried it out. I was the new vessel. I tried to scream, but the only sound that came out was a low, perfect hum. If you enjoyed this descent into the silence of Oakhaven, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to keep bringing these nightmares to life. What would you do if you were trapped in a town that forbids sound? Let us know in the comments below.